I'm Conrad, one of the maintainers of Pry. Just before we get started, how many people already know about Pry? Oh, wow. That's kind of cool. So if you don't know, the easiest way to think of Pry is that it's like IRB, but better. So just like you can type Ruby code into IRB, and it tells you the answer, you can type Ruby code into Pry, and it tells you the answer. I say, but better for about 3 reasons. Firstly, we have syntax highlighting. That means it's really easy to read the output of Pry. It's really easy to see where you are and what you've been doing. Secondly, we have Pry commands. Pry commands exist to wrap all of Ruby's really nice introspection APIs in a way that's intuitive and easy to use, so you can very quickly get a feel for the shape of your program. And thirdly, we have binding.pry. This is the kind of unique selling point of Pry, and what it lets you do is open a REPL or a Pry session in the middle of a running program. So you can debug problems, you can just get a feel for what your program is actually doing when it runs. And while those things are cool, it's hard to visualize what the point is. And so what I like to think of it is, Pry is absolutely everything you need to program in Ruby, apart from a text editor. And the reason that's important is because developers spend about 40% of their time writing code. The remaining 60% of the time, which is like more than half of your time, is spent debugging. So you need a tool like Pry that can get you into the code, and so you know what's going on. When I said I was going to talk about Pry, John Mayer said I had to talk about him, so this is a little bit of history. In 2010, he was working on a graphics library and trying to debug some problem. 3 years of procrastination later, we now have a debugging library, but no graphics library that I'm aware of. Ryan and I are the other gem maintainers, and we have 71 different people contributing. We have 2 million downloads. So Pry is about 1/10 as big as Rails, if you want a scale comparison. The typical Rails introduction is how to write a blog engine. And as you'll know from the various videos and internets, blog engines always work straight away the first time you write them. I tried to write a blog engine too, and I found out that it wasn't quite as easy as things made out. And so I thought the way I would go through Pry is by showing you some of the problems I came across while building this completely fictional blog engine, and how I used Pry to solve them. So in particular, Pry, rather than having a few really big features, has lots and lots and lots of small things that save you time. And so it's much easier to describe it as several sets of Pry features that work together, rather than going through each different feature in alphabetical order. So for my blog engine, I had basically 2 requirements. Firstly, only I should be able to post blog posts. This meant I needed some kind of authentication. As we're all web programmers, we'll know about HTTP basic authentication. This is actually built into web browsers, though no one uses it because the UI is really bad. What happens is the browser will ask me for a username and password. Then it will join them together with a colon, base64 encode them, and send them to me in an HTTP header. This is great because Ruby already has a base64 library, so I can just use that to decode it. The only problem is I often find it hard to remember how to use the base64 library. And so I can use Pry to show me how this works. So very obviously, I can start Pry just like I can start IRB by typing it into bash. And here's the prompt. We're on line 1. We're inside Pry, and we're at the main object. Just like IRB, I can type any Ruby into Pry, require base64. That's just valid Ruby. I hit enter, and Pry syntax highlights it. So it's easy to see what's going on. What's less easy to see so far is how do I use this base64 library? And that's where Pry commands come in. So I can run the ls command. It looks like a method, but it's not. The ls command is going to show me the list of methods on a module. Just like in bash, ls shows you the list of files in a directory. In Pry, shows you the list of methods on a module. So I run it, and I found out that there are actually 6 different ways of using base64 in Ruby. Decode and encode. I always forget the 64 on the end. That's why I can never remember how to use it. And strict versions and URL safe versions. And looking at a list of methods like this is fine. And because I can look it up so quickly, it doesn't matter that I can't remember it. But I find that if I can just try using stuff, it helps cement my knowledge. So let's try just playing with the library and see how it works. So I start typing out base64.encode64. But because I'm really bad at typing, halfway through, I just stop and use tab completion. I'm sure you've seen tab completion in Bash. You've even seen it in IRB. Pry's is better, obviously. And all this will do is complete the method name for me. So I run base64.encode64 on high, and it gives me back something that looks very much like base64, quote agk equals blah. And then I want to try doing the opposite. So I can type base64.decode64. Again, I can use tab completion on this. But instead of trying to type out quote agk equals /n quote, I can use underscore. So Pry maintains this local variable underscore. It doesn't look like a local because it has no letters in it, but in Ruby, that's all it is. And it's always the same value as was last output. So in this case, it's exactly the same as quote agk equals. And unsurprisingly, if I run this, I decode this, it gives me back exactly the same input. And so hopefully, that's how the base64 library works. That said, looking back at this list of methods, I'm kind of confused. Any method with the word strict in it makes me worry. Like, why would I need the strict version? And I can just ask Pry. So QuestionMark, another command. It doesn't look like a method anymore because QuestionMark's just a symbol. It's actually short for showDoc, but it's so useful we just abbreviated it to QuestionMark. So I run QuestionMark, and it's going to show me the documentation of this method. QuestionMark base64.strict encode64. And you can see that it's defined somewhere in the standard library. It's on the singleton class of base64. It's a public method that takes this one argument called bin. Returns the base64 encoded version of bin. This method complies with RFC 4648. No line feeds are added. Huh. So it turns out, and this has nothing to do with Pry, I just thought that everyone who does Ruby should know, if you look at the documentation for encode64, it actually adds line feeds every 60 characters, which is almost never what you actually want. So if you want to base64 encode stuff, use this strict encode64 method. And this is the kind of information that, because Pry makes it so easy to look up documentation, you can just find out for yourself. And so, in a nutshell, that's kind of the first third of what Pry can do. It gets a bit more exciting from here on in if you're thinking, oh, I've seen all this before. But we have evaluating Ruby code, the entire point. You can type in Ruby, it tells you the answer. We have color. It makes it friendly. It's easy to see what's going on. We have tab completion so that you don't have to type. And then we have underscore, which keeps track of the last thing that Pry output. This means you don't need to always assign everything to a variable. Pry just does that automatically for you. The ls command is taken straight from Bash. In Bash, it lists the files in a directory. In Pry, it lists the methods on a module. And finally, QuestionMark or showDoc, show me the documentation for this method. So now we have an idea of how to use the base64 library. I went ahead and I wrote myself a HTTP basic auth decoder. I'm sure there's one already, but I kind of like reinventing wheels. And I went ahead and did it, and it turns out that it doesn't work. So let's have a look at the code I wrote. I can use Pry's cat command. Again, straight from Bash. Cat just takes a file and outputs it to standard out. But as with normal in Pry, it's added syntax highlighting, so we can easily see what's going on. So this code does two things. It requires the base64 library and then defines these methods. So basic auth.encode is going to take a username and password, join them together with a colon, encode the result using strict encode64, and then add the word basic on the front. And then the decode method looks like it's going to do the opposite. So it extracts out the base64 using string square brackets. Then it splits it on a colon and decodes it. So let's try using this library and see what happens. I can use another feature of Pry here, which is underscore file underscore. What Underfile is just a memoization of the last file that a Pry command touched. So the cat command is very obviously acting on a file. The showDoc command was also acting on a file, and there are various other commands that are touching files. These are all stored in underscore file so that you can access them easily. So in this case, I can require file, it returns true, job done. And again, let's try using the library. Not because I need to remember how it works, I just wrote it, but just to test that it does actually work the way I think. So I try making it an HTTP basic header. My username is hi, my password is mum. And it gives me back something that looks about right. Again, I decode. Again, I'm using underscore, so I don't have to type everything out again. But this time, when I hit enter, it explodes. Undefined method unpack for square bracket quote AG. Bleh. WTF? So it turns out that Pry supports WTF. And it shows you the backtrace. And you can see, hopefully, that this problem is somewhere inside the Ruby standard library, so probably not my fault directly. But on line 2, which we've called line 1, because we started from 0, there is a problem on line 10 of this basic auth file in the decode method. So let's have a look and see if we can see what the problem is. $, so QuestionMark is show doc, $ is show source. You can expand it out if you need, but mostly people just use $, because, again, it's very common. We run this. Again, it shows us where it's from. It's from this basic auth.rb in my home directory. The method's defined on the singleton class of basic auth. It's a public method again. And if I read this more carefully now, I notice that base64 extraction using string square brackets looks right. If you haven't seen string square brackets before, it's one of the most cool things in Ruby. So use pry or rdog to find out what it does. And then on the next line, I have a problem. The colon is actually inside the base64 encoded data, but I'm calling split on the data before I've decoded it. That means that split's going to return this single element array, which contains just the base64, and then I pass that array into decode 64. And that's where it explodes, because somewhere underneath it's calling unpack on array, and arrays don't support unpack. So this is very easy to fix. All I need to do is edit. Pry has an edit method, or an edit command, sorry, that you just give it a method name, and it will open it in a text editor. As I mentioned before, I'm very bad at typing, so I don't want to have to repeat myself. And it turns out there's a really useful feature of Readline. So this works in Bash and IRB and Pry, called auth underscore. And what this does is it takes the last word of the previous line, where word is space separated. So in this case, the last word is basicauth.decode, and it just copies it down to the current line. If you're on a Mac and you have Readline installed, then you can use escape underscore. It's not quite configured correctly by default. So I hit alt underscore, and it immediately fills in this word, basicauth.decode. I then run the edit command, and it opens my text editor. So the fix is very simple. I'm just going to add some brackets around this base64 so that the splitting is happening on the decoded data rather than the encoded data. And then I close Sublime, and I'm back in Pry. What's less obvious is that in the background, Pry has actually reloaded the file. So the fix I made to the method on the file system has now been loaded into Pry. This means that if I try running these tests again, it will actually work. So let's try that. Typo avoidance is the kind of secondary goal here. So instead of typing out basicauth.encode again, I'm going to use Control-R. Again, this works in Bash and IRB and Pry, and it gives you reverse search. So I want to rerun the line that was basicauth.encode, so I just type enc. That matches basicauth.encode, and so Pry copies the line down for me. My username is hi, my password is mum. I hit return, and still that method works, which is what we expect. I didn't change it. I then use Control-R again, and I can run decode. And this time, it gives me back my username and password. Awesome. So we fixed it. As a kind of aside, if I hadn't wanted to use underscore there, or I hadn't wanted to rerun the encode method, I could have used underscore out underscore, which is another of these Pry special local variables. I could have found the last time I ran encode, then found the number of that line, and then underscore out to that number is the output of Pry at that point. So with the method fixed, what did we learn about Pry? WTF, the most famously named Pry command, shows you the backtrace of the most recent exception. Before that command existed, you could get this data using underscore ex underscore dot backtrace, which is another Pry special local that's keeping track of the most recent exception. Then there's $, which shows you the source of a method. I don't know whether it says something about me or about Ruby programmers, but I always reach for $, rather than question mark for showing documentation. Then there's edit, which is going to edit the method in your editor. You can configure this to use Vim or Emacs or Sublime or whatever you like. Then two features that are actually from Readline and Pry has just borrowed. Alt underscore or escape underscore copies the last word of the previous line down onto the current line. And Control R lets you search history backwards so that you can see, or so that you can quickly retype lines that you've typed before. Then I've mentioned quite a few of these special locals already. Underscore file underscore is the most recent file you touched with a pry command, useful for requiring. And underscore dir underscore is just the directory that contains that file. Underscore out underscore is an array of all the previous values of underscore, of the special local underscore. And underscore in underscore is everything you've ever typed into Pry. So with my basic auth stuff working, the next step in writing a blog engine is, of course, to make the URLs pretty. So I want to be able to write a blog post. It has a title like, hey, come use Pry. And instead of spaces in the URL, which look ugly because they get %20'd, I want to replace everything that's not a letter by a hyphen. And then that just looks pretty in my URL. So I wrote some code to do this, and story of my life, it didn't work. So I tried running this, and you can see this exception has happened somewhere deep inside. So on line 11 in make safe, I'm calling gsub on nil. Anyone else called gsub on nil recently? Yeah. And this problem is probably not caused by line 11. I didn't just write nil.gsub in my code. The actual problem is probably somewhere around line 7. But this whole thing is being kicked off from line 19. So let's have a go at debugging it. Again, I open this code in Sublime, and we can have a look at what's going on. So this class post is encapsulating a blog post. It takes some params that I've parsed out of JSON, or in this example, just typed directly into the file, stores them in an instance variable, and then provides two methods that other people can call. Safe title, which is this version of the title with everything replaced by hyphens, and then the make safe function, which is actually what's implementing the replacement. So it's taking a string, removing anything that's not a letter or a number, and replacing it by a hyphen. And make safe looks fine, so the fact that the bug's is probably not there. It takes in a string and it calls gsub on it. That should work. So in order to debug stuff with Pry, we use binding.pry. I mentioned this at the start, and this is it. And so what this means is that when my program gets to line 18, instead of getting instantly to line 19 and then crashing, it's going to open a Pry session right there, which means I can play around with this new post object and hopefully figure out why it's not working. So I've edited the file. I then try running it again. And instead of the exception and fairly unreadable backtrace I got last time, I'm now in Pry. So you can see from this arrow that Pry is helpfully telling you, hi, you're here on line 18. Feel free to have a look around. Just before we do that, I like to make a habit of checking that the problem is actually where I think the problem is, because I've wasted so much time in the past debugging issues that weren't actually the right issue. And we can do that by running play-l19. So Pry's play command lets you run code that's around you in the environment. -l is the line, so if I play line 19, it's exactly the same as if I'd just typed in line 19. And unsurprisingly, it still crashes in the same way. Undefined method, gsub for nil. So what are we going to do about this? The problem is probably in this new post object. And so let's cd into it and have a look. In bash, cd changes directories. In Pry, cd changes the value of self. And when I hit return, you can see that the prompt is now telling me I'm in an instance of post. So if you've not seen it before, hash angle brackets is kind of Ruby shorthand for an instance of. We're still on line 3, and the :1 just means I've cd'd once from the top, and is otherwise not that important. ls, again from bash, lets me find out what's going on here. And this time you can see that ls has not just shown me which methods are available, but also shown me that I have an instance variable, this @params that I passed in, and also these locals. So the locals on this slide are colored in red, and they all start with an underscore because they're the special locals that Pry gives you. I think we've covered most of them. _Pry_ is the instance of Pry itself, if you're curious and want to have a look at how Pry works. So I think we came to the conclusion before that I have a bug somewhere in this safe title method. So we can use show source or $ to show the source again. And because I'm inside an object, Pry is just going to do the right thing. It knows which method I want. If I wanted to be explicit, I could use this hash, which means an instance method. So I want to show the safe title instance method defined on the post class. I run that, and I get the same thing as before. Now, this method on its own looks right to me. I'm passing the title into the makeSafe function. That should give me a safe title. But I know from experience that it doesn't work. It raises an exception. And it's not so obvious why until I look at params. And you can see I've made Ruby Noob 101 error. I have a hash that has strings as keys, and I've tried to read out of it using symbols. And so at params to the symbol title is going to be nil. And when I pass that into makeSafe, I get the error message that we've seen. Undefined method gsub for nil. The other interesting thing to note is I can just access at params. I really am inside an instance of this object. I can call private methods. I can access instance variables. I can pry into all of its secrets, if you will. Again, fixing this isn't hard, but I've already shown you how to use edit with a method name, so I had to think of something new. And here we have edit --x. So edit --x is a shorthand for edit where the most recent exception happened. So you'll remember when I played line 19, it raised that error, undefined method gsub for nil. Edit --x is going to open up the file that had that error right on the line that raised an exception. So if you compare that to manually opening your text editor, trying to find the right line, it's just much, much faster. I run edit --x, I'm back in Sublime. I make the change I need to make, which is just to replace the symbol up there by a string. And then I'm back in Pry. Again, Pry has reloaded the code for me, so everything should now work. Just in case you weren't watching, the diff is that. Take out the symbol, put in the string. And also, you can run getdiff from inside Pry. Any line that starts with a dot gets forwarded straight onto your shell. So if you need to run something like getdiff or, I don't know, rm-rf, you can do that. You can do that from inside Pry, and it will just work as you expect. So we've debugged the problem. Let's go back to where we were. So we can just cd ... Dot isn't an object in Ruby, but we've taken the same shorthand as bash for take me out a level. So we run cd ... and we're back at Pry main. I didn't explain what main is. For those of you who don't know, if you're not inside a class or a method in Ruby, then self still has a value. And it's this special object that Ruby creates at boot time called main. It creates it by just doing object.new and then defining 2s to return main. So that's why when you open a Pry session by default, it will say main. It's this special object that Ruby has. But that's not very useful because I need to know more than that. Like everywhere it says main. So where actually am I? And Pry has where am I, which will remind you, you're still on line 18. You're still trying to debug this issue where line 19 was broken. So we think we fixed it. I made the change to the file. And indeed, if I run that line again, either using play-l or just typing it out, I now see new post with a hyphen. So this can clearly just be put in a URL, and then I'll be able to link to my blog post, and people will be able to read the contents of the link. Somewhat more surprisingly, it's also got hashrocket nil in there. And that's because puts actually does two things. Firstly, it outputs what you tell it to output, and then it returns nil. Now, I've been doing Ruby for a while, so I know puts always returns nil, and I don't need Pry to remind me of that every single time. And so what I can do is add a semicolon to the end of the line. Once I do that, then Pry is told, don't show me the output. And so if I run it, I still see new post, because the puts method has done that as a side effect, but I don't see hashrocket nil, because Pry has been told to elide the output. This is actually more useful when you have a function that returns a large amount of XML or a big blob of JSON or whatever's cool with data interchange formats. Because if you just let it run, then Pry is going to happily try and syntax highlight all of this output. And 5 minutes later, you're still waiting for it to say something that you already knew. And so the semicolon will just tell Pry to skip the whole output phase. Finally, I'm done with Pry. I can just hit Control-D. So I could have typed out exit, which does the same thing, but Control-D is a much quicker and easier way of doing it. And as an aside, if I was CD'd into a new object still, then Control-D would have just done the same as CD ... So it only exits one level of pry. It then lets my program continue running. And so line 19 triggers for the 4th time, and we see new post again. And then we're back in bash and ready to do whatever we needed to do next. So this is the kind of meat of pry, in particular binding.pry. So you'll notice that when something crashed on line 19, I went and added a binding.pry on line 18. And I'm sure most of you have done something very similar in the past. You have a crash on line 19, and you add a put statement on line 18. Don't do that, OK? So there are 3 reasons why binding.pry is better than a put statement. 1, it's always the same thing. That means the chances of you typoing it and generating yet another exception that you have to deal with are very low. You can even have an editor shortcut that types it for you. 2, if the put statement shows you something that you were expecting, or something that you were just totally not expecting, there's nothing you can do apart from add another put statement, rerun the program from the start, or rerun the web request again, and hope that the second put statement tells you something interesting. If you have a binding.pry, you can use that just like a put statement. You type in the variable name that you want to see, and it outputs it in color. And if it's not what you expected, or something totally weird is happening, you're then in a debugger, and you can look around, and you can see why that has happened. And the third reason is completely gone. It's so, particularly in Rails, if you have a large amount of log output, and particularly in development, I certainly do, I add a put statement, and then I have to scroll back to try and find it. So I end up adding 3 put statements. The first one is put star times 500, then puts what I want to see, and then put star times 500. And now I can see my output. With pry, I don't need to do that, because it stops the process right there. I can have a look at what's going on. And then when I've done figuring out the problem, I can continue. So if anyone remembers anything, please remember, use binding.pry and not puts. It will save you time. The other commands that we have here, cd, lets you go inside an object. You can really look inside. You can access instance variables. You can call private methods. It's as though you were running code inside that object itself. Where am I? Useful if you've been CDing around and you've now no idea where you are. It will just remind you you're still on line 18. You're still trying to debug this problem on the next line. Edit -- x is the most common use for edit method is fixing a method that's broken. And the method that's broken is probably the one that just raised an exception. So edit -- x will just jump you to your editor at exactly the right point to fix it. And play -l, you can play a line of input from the file you're in. Play takes various other arguments depending on what code you want to play. You can also pass it a range if you want more than one line. Dot forwards everything into bash or into your shell so that you can run anything from inside pry. Useful for one-off things. If you want to do a lot, then I advise actually opening a new terminal. Control-D is the same as cd ... or exit, so take me out one level and then let the program run. And a semicolon at the end of the line hides the output from pry. So hopefully that's given you an idea of why I use pry all the time and why I think you should all use pry all the time. And I wanted to reiterate that everything I've shown you so far is core pry. It's written in Ruby. It works on MRI. It works on JRuby. It works on RBX. I'm then going to move on to showing you some plugins. Now, these almost all have C extensions, and so they don't work reliably on RBX or JRuby, though they do in places. In particular, 2 plugins that are very useful are Pry Rescue and Pry Stack Explorer. So you'll remember that when I wanted to debug this exception that happened on line 19, I had to edit the file, find line 19, add a binding.pry, close the file, then run the entire program again. If I was using Pry Rescue, that would have all been automatic for me. The exception happened, and boom, Pry is open. I can debug it without needing to do that whole edit rerun cycle. This keeps the code clean because I didn't have to change it to see this. And again, if you run something inside Pry that raises an exception, Pry Rescue lets you just cd into the exception. And so you can see what was happening when it was raised. Stack Explorer combines really nicely with this and also just a vanilla binding.pry, and it's useful for that tracking down a nil. So I have this problem where the code says string.gsub, but at runtime it's nil.gsub, and clearly the problem was somewhere up the call stack. So I can just run up, I move up the call stack, and then I can see what's going on as though I had put a binding.pry on the level above. If you're using Rails, then Better Errors actually implements all of this stuff, but in a web UI. By default, it's not using Pry as a REPL, though it does use some of the same supporting libraries. And you can configure it to use Pry with bettererrors.usepry. So the web interface looks kind of like this, and if you're not using it yet, you probably should be. It lets you click at any line in the call stack of an exception that was raised, and it gives you a REPL to type in. So just like PryRescue or Pry Stack Explorer, this gives you instant debugging of exceptions without having to go through add put statements, add binding.prys. The other plugin I wanted to call out is Pry Debugger. So this wraps the Ruby debugger, which is a CloudWalker gem, I think, and it adds step-through debugging to Pry. So it adds breakpoints, you can step, you can go next, and then you can continue, just like step-through debuggers that you know and love. Luckily, you don't have to remember all of the cool plugins because someone has already written them down for you. And Pry Plus is a collection of these 3 core plugins, like Pry Debugger, PryRescue, Pry Stack Explorer. If they didn't require C extensions, they would probably be in Pry itself. Then there's PryDoc and PryDocMore, which give you documentation for C methods and Ruby syntax. By default, the QuestionMark command can only do Ruby methods because we literally just find where the method was defined and look for the documentation above it. Then there's Bond. Bond improves the tab completion of Pry even more. It lets you tab complete not just method names, but also arguments to hashes. So it will look at the hash you're accessing and tab complete the contents of the square brackets so that you can do it. And then gist lets you integrate with gist.github.com, because who doesn't want to share code? This is RailsConf, so you should also all install PryRails. This replaces RailsC, which uses IRB by default, by one that uses Pry. It should also preserve all of the reload functionality and the get functionality that you need from the Rails console. It also contains some commands like show models, which is basically ls, but more Railsy. So 60% of your time is spent debugging. Pry will help you avoid that. Thank you very much.